That's right. We are pleased to welcome now Ben Milam, Multimedia Journalist, SuperTalk Mississippi News.
Hey, Gerard, good to be with you, man.
All right,
what do you want
Ben.
to talk about?
Oh, man, I want to also inform our audience that we've got former Governor Phil Bryant joining us at 10:35. He's down at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And then Amanda Gunasacra, former EPA chief of staff under President Trump, at 11:05. All right, Ben, any surprises here in the state of Mississippi? I don't think so.
Yeah, none big. I mean, the majority of the close races that we were watching were judicial seats. Of course, this was not a relatively major statewide election cycle, but we did have one on the. I'm going to make sure I get my numbers correct here, but on the Supreme Court, we had 2 contested seats, and I think those really, in terms of statewide election, were what grabbed most people's attention across Mississippi. The first one, District 2, Position 2, has not been called yet. We have not had one of these 2 contested seats called. But David Sullivan running against incumbent Don Beam, who was appointed by Phil Bryant and then won re-election in 2016, running for her second full term on the Supreme Court. She was the odds-on favorite coming into this, of course, as the incumbent, but by all factors as well. And David Sullivan, right now, with 93% of votes counted and reported, David Sullivan is up almost 10 points there, 54.8% for Sullivan, 45.2% for Justice Dawn Beam, who is currently the only woman serving on the state's high court. And so we expect that to go to Sullivan, of course, with just 7% of votes left to count. Everything kind of points to David Sullivan taking that seat from Justice Dawn Beam. But speaking of women on the high court, the other contested Supreme Court race that we were looking at, Justice Jim Kitchens, the incumbent, longtime incumbent, running for his third full term, has been on the Supreme Court for 16 years. We talked about it, I think it was last week or the week before. We expected that to go to a runoff. Excuse me. That race has also not been called. Justice Jim Kitchens being challenged by 4 other candidates. Jennifer Branning out of Neshoba County, kind of got a lot of the attention and ran a really popular campaign, by pretty much every metric. And she is, again, this has not been called, but she is ahead. She has 41.7% of the vote with 91% of votes counted and reported. This is the District 1 Position 3 Supreme Court seat. Jim Kitchens, 35.5%. So about a 6%, a 6-point separation there. And this looks very much like it will be headed to a runoff. Ceola James, 10.4%. Byron Carter, Abby Robinson behind her. And so it looks like Jennifer Branning, Jim Kitchens will be headed for a runoff. That would be the, don't quote me on this, but I believe November 24th. It'll be at the end of November, I think the final week of
Thanksgiving
November
week.
26th. Yeah, you're right. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Again, you can look that up to verify my information. It was kind of a late night, so please don't quote me on that. But that does very much look like it's heading to a runoff. And so I don't think that's a surprise. I think the surprise, if you have to find a surprise in terms of Mississippi elections, it would be David Sullivan right now on top of Don Beam. Again, that race has not been called yet.
Yeah. I think it's Thanksgiving week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, interesting night for sure. Do we have any data, Ben, about the number of votes cast, for example, for the former president versus, say, the Senate race, Roger Wicker? It's my understanding that the senator actually received more votes than did the president.
Yeah, that is. Well, we can find out right now. Donald Trump, 655,094 in Mississippi. Roger Wicker, 668,802. So
slightly.
Yeah, about 13,000 more there. But yeah, I think I think it was a really high-quality turnout. We talked to some people with MS Votes last night, and in particular, they were really encouraged by the young voter turnout, college age and young adults, and those who had, maybe just become eligible to vote. That's one thing Michael Watson has, I think, really emphasized is getting young people registered to vote and getting them out to the polls. And so, everything points to it being really high-quality turnout, I think, across the board based on what we heard last night. Of course, there's still some data to come in terms of demographics and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think just with how contentious this presidential election and race was, you had a lot of candidates down the ballot that really benefited from that because people were coming out for the presidential election, and
no doubt,
obviously you make votes down the ballot too. But one thing I did want to mention, one of the most interesting races really of last night that still has not been called yet. Again, we had the majority of the contested elections in Mississippi statewide were judicial seats, but the Mississippi Court of Appeals, there were 3 Court of Appeals seats that were unopposed, not contested, but Mississippi Court of Appeals District 5 Position 2 seat. This is in South Mississippi, primarily the coast. Amy St. Pé, Jennifer Schloegel, and Ian Baker. We were watching this pretty much from the start, from about, call it 7:15, really right after 7 o'clock, to late into the night, almost to the early morning hours, and it was just about 33% for each of those 3 candidates, almost the entire way.
Wow. And
one would pull ahead and, would be up by 2 points, and we would say, okay, well, Jennifer Schloegel looks like might be pulling away with this thing, but then we look, 5% more of the votes were counted, and it would totally flip-flop, and somebody else would be on top. Ian Baker would be on top. St. Pé would be on top. Right now, Amy St. Pé has a little less than a 2.5-point advantage over Jennifer Schloegel. For that Court of Appeals seat, Ian Baker is 0.3% behind Schloegel. And so that looks like it's headed to a runoff. Still 8% of votes to be reported there in that Southern District for the Court of Appeals. And so that very well could change, just given how close this was. I mean, that could totally flip-flop. Baker could be on top, and it could be inverse, whatever that may be. But right now, St. Pé with 2.5-point advantage, and that's the largest advantage we really saw from this race from watching it from 7 o'clock last night. So that's certainly one to keep an eye on. That's again that one looks like it's headed to a runoff as well.
Ben, did we have any reports from the Secretary of State's offices or in any of the counties, clerks, elections officials about any sorts of election irregularity or concerns or problems there?
Yeah, we did. We got some word from the Secretary of State's office last night. We got some word from them about middle afternoon and then closer to when the polls closed. And there were some minimal things, but in large part, the officials we talked to with the Secretary of State's office said that those were expected issues and errors, and you're always going to have some things go wrong just because it's humans running this system, right? But nothing that led them to believe that it really changed any sort of outcome or any sort of factor in the voting process, period. And so we feel really good about that. And I think, part of all of this conversation and rhetoric that has been around in really the last 10, 20 years of voter fraud and just the integrity of the election process in America has made these election officials tune in that much closer and be so zoomed in on every little piece, every moving part of the election process from the local to the national level. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think, when there is a little hiccup or a software issue like we saw in Pennsylvania last night, whatever it is, it's going to be widely reported. And I think it's a lot harder to get away with anything at all. And in Mississippi, it appears it was a clean night.
Yeah. So overall smooth.
Overall smooth.
That's right. Good. That's what we want.
That's exactly right.
Ben, great report. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming in.
Appreciate you, Gerard.
Folks, we're stepping aside for a break. When we return in the Element Wealth studio, we've got the former governor of Mississippi, Phil Bryant. He'll be calling in from Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Stay